Hi everybody, in this video we're going to talk about erosional sedimentary structures and syn-sedimentary deformational structures. We'll start with erosional structures. Erosional structures are those that are caused by the erosion of sediment rather than deposition. Erosion can be recognized in a sedimentary deposit whenever a surface cuts down through existing sediment like this surface does, and this surface truncates the underlying beds, which otherwise would have gone right through that small channel. In this case, the scour, represented by this channel, is filled in with sediment that onlaps the sides of the channels. And then the entire package, the scour, the channel, and what fills it is overlapped by younger sediment. So this filled in channel would be termed a scour and fill type of structure. But what it represents is some sort of channelized flow that's scoured down into the underlying sediment and then was covered by younger sediment. So when erosion takes place and then that erosion is filled in by sediment, the erosional features can be preserved as casts on the bottom of the bed that does the infilling. So erosional structures can also be preserved on the bottoms of beds as casts filling in erosional surfaces, in which case we would call them soil marks. These flute casts are a good example of a type of soil mark that's caused by turbulent flow scouring pits into a bed or into a substrate, which then, once they are excavated, shallow and widen in a downstream direction. So I'll outline for you some of these flute casts. There's one there, one there, one there, etc., etc., etc. And all of these flutes sort of point in a V in the upstream direction and widen in the downstream direction, so they're a good indicator that the current direction was that way. And again, they're caused just by turbulent current scouring a bed, which is then infilled by sediment and preserved as casts on the bottom of another bed. Okay, another type of soil mark is illustrated by these groove casts. You can see some long linear grooves here that were carved into the sediment below this bed, and there are several of them, and they're all pointing the same direction. Groove casts can either be caused by local erosion due to a very turbulent current, or they can be caused by the current dragging something along the bed and creating a groove in the underlying bed as it goes. But either way, they're filled in by sediment from the overlying bed, and they provide a good indication of current direction. But here we don't know whether the current was going that way or that way, but at least we know that it was one of the two, and it could not have been that way. There are lots of different types of what are called tool marks. Tool marks are marks that are made by objects within a flow rather than the flow itself. So here's some marks made on the bottom of a bed by objects skipping or prodding or poking the substrate, and then they're filled in by the overlying bed. And there's some groove casts that are preserved in the bed behind this one. So if you look carefully here, there's a lot of sort of isolated little marks on this bed, some of which may be caused by an object skipping along the bed. Some of them may have been caused by an object coming in contact with the bed only once, and some of them may be caused by an object dragging along the bed. And this particular feature here is aligned with the groove casts in the back, which are telling you that the current direction was either that way or that way. Okay, Syn-sedimentary deformation is deformation that occurs between the time that one layer of sediment is deposited and the next. We can tell that the deformation is Syn-sedimentary because it is stratabound. One deformed layer is sandwiched between two undeformed layers, like in this photo. So if you look carefully here, you can see that there's a bed of sediment that is deformed, and there are actually several layers in here that are deformed in a similar fashion, and these deformed layers sit on top of undeformed layers and are overlain by undeformed layers, which is what we mean by something being stratabound. And that indicates that the deformation happened if we have time 1 there, time 2 there, and time 3 there, that the deformation happened in between time 2 and time 3. There are, in general, 5 main ways that Syn-sedimentary deformation can occur. The first of these is loading, which occurs when one layer of sediment is too heavy to be supported by the one below it, and the layers of sediment collapse into each other. Fluid shearing occurs when a moving fluid deforms wet, loose sediment below it. Liquefaction and water escape occur when too much water is trapped between grains of deposited sediment and then the water gets released upwards. Slumping happens when layers of sediment slide down slope as a semi-coherent mass. And expansion and contraction occur usually at the sediment surface, usually when wet sediment is exposed to air or when dry sediment is wetted, causing mud, for example, to expand or contract. One of the most common types of load structures are flame structures. They usually occur when wet mud is loaded by rapid deposition of sand from suspension, for example, during deposition of a turbidity current. So right underneath this sand bed, you see that there are a series of structures that look kind of like wispy flames. And we know that these structures are load structures and not just erosion of the sand into the mud, because if we look carefully, you can see that the layers of mud are injected up into those flames. So what happened is that the sandstone up here above the contact was deposited rapidly, and when it was deposited rapidly, it applied a load on the underlying mud, and the sandstone, or the sand at that time, foundered or sunk down into the mud, and the mud got injected up into the gaps between those foundering blocks of sand. That's even more well illustrated here. Here you can see a bed of sandstone situated above layers of siltstone and mudstone, and those layers are pretty clearly deformed and injected upwards into to that flame structure. So this is a large-scale flame structure, and it indicates that this coarse-grained sand was rapidly deposited. Deforming the mudstone below it. Ball and pillow structure is a structure that occurs when balls of sediment from the load sink down into and pinch off from the rest of the overlying deposit and fall completely into the bed below. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at the contact between a light-colored bed and a brown bed, and that contact is loaded and a lot of the features that you see here look somewhat like flame structures. Again, you're having some of that overlying sediment sink down into the underlying sediment, which is then injected upwards. But here, we've got a block of the overlying light-colored sediment that's basically pinched off into the underlying sediment. And that deformation associated with this loading extends way down deep into the sediment below. Again, we know that this is Syn-sedimentary deformation because the beds above are not deformed. They go parallel over that surface. Water mixed with sediment forms a dense fluid that, if it's moving, is capable of deforming the sediment beneath it. So here we have two horizontal layers, cross-bedding above, cross-bedding below. And in between them are sets of cross-beds that have pretty clearly undergone deformation. And the way in which this would happen is if you had a very dense sediment-laden fluid dragging over the top of, let's say, a dune and deforming the crossbeds shortly after they form. Features like these deformed crossbeds can be produced by dragging a bag of cement across a wet cross-bedded sand. Dish structures are a common water escape structure. When sediment is deposited rapidly from suspension, a lot of excess water can remain trapped between the grains. If the sediment is porous, the water will escape in sheet-like pathways that can be temporarily impeded by layering in the sediment. So if you look carefully here, you can see some original layering in the sediment that in places is broken. So we've got some fluid escape pipes that are breaking those layers of sediment and escaping upward through the breakage. And each one of these little upturned layers that is broken like that is termed a dish. And in places you can see some vertical pathways as well. These are called pillars. The dish structures are usually light in color, and that's because they are fluid pathways. They've been washed clean of all the dark-colored organic matter and clay because of fluid traveling upwards along them. And dish structures tend to increase in number as you go upwards through a deposit. So we see a lot more pillars up here, and we see a lot more dishes as we go upwards through the deposit. Convolute bedding is a general descriptive term for bedding that looks convoluted. Sometimes you just have to interpret what happened to produce it. In this case, what it looks like is we had some climbing ripples. We talked about those last time. And climbing ripples, again, occur under conditions of rapid sediment fallout from suspension. And when you get rapid sediment fallout from suspension, you deposit sediment in a really unstable fashion. So if you look, here are the angle of climb is increasing through here. And it looks like what happened is you piled up so much sediment with so much water in between the grains that eventually it just couldn't sustain itself anymore and it started to collapse. And you probably have a little bit of water escape coming up through these collapse structures. And that's what's creating the convolute bedding. This is a great analogy for what happens when one layer of sediment detaches from the layer beneath it to form a slump. The deposit results is buckled and folded. And very often we can look at the direction of the buckling to determine which direction the slump was transported in. And this is a great example of that. Here we've got a surface above which all of the sediment was detached. And we can see that layers of sediment were buckled in the direction of slump transport. So downslope in this case would have been this way, and all this sediment was transported in that direction as a semi-coherent mass, and the layers are folded because they've been deformed as they slid downslope. When wet mud dries or desiccates, it becomes more brittle, and it also shrinks. The change in volume within the mud forces the brittle mud to crack, often in pretty regular polygonal patterns. So we've got some cracks here that form a network of polygons. Sometimes they're a lot more regular than this. These are somewhat irregular. And each one of these cracks extends down, usually on the order of millimeters into the mud. These mud cracks indicate that the wet mud dried out, which means that it must have been exposed to air at some point. So mud cracks don't form in deep marine environments. They can only form in nearshore or terrestrial environments that have been wetted and dried. And in this case, these mud cracks formed on a dry lake bed. If you look at mud cracks from the side, you'll notice that when mud cracks form, they form only, usually, along a single layer at the surface. And so when that single layer cracks, it detaches from its neighbors, and each crack is free to shrink then on its own, and most of the shrinkage is taken up by curling of the mud cracks. And so these are individual polygons, as viewed from above. We would call these desiccation polygons that have cracked and then curled up as they dried out further. This can also tell you which way is up. Another feature of mud cracks is that very commonly the upper surface of mud cracks, and I'm just drawing this in, you don't actually see this here. The upper surface of mud cracks looks like a V or a wedge, and that also can tell you which way is up. Syneresis cracks are mud cracks that form underwater when the chemistry of the water draws water directly out of mud. And this typically happens in waters, seawater that's excessively salty, for example. They're different from desiccation cracks in that they don't form regular polygons, and they often have a preferred orientation. So you can see that a lot of these cracks are kind of going the same way or close to it. And they don't form regular polygons. They don't connect up into a network of polygons, each of which can shrink independently of its neighbors. Instead, the whole mass is sort of bleeding water into the overlying water column, and the cracking is not nearly as organized as desiccation cracks. Well, lastly, because sediment is deposited at the Earth's surface, and that's where organisms live, sediment also often preserves traces of biological activity. Dinosaur footprints, like the one shown here, are actually a lot more common than you might think. Far more common than dinosaur footprints, however, are trace fossils, also called Ichnofossils, that are produced by smaller, less exotic organisms that interact with sediment in various ways. So in the back of this slide, you can see a number of burrows that are preserved on the base of a sandstone bed, preserving the behavior of the organism that made the burrow. So trace fossils reflect the behavior of the organism that made them, but not necessarily the type of organism. So there are a lot of trace fossils that are made by soft-bodied organisms that are never preserved as actual fossils. There are 5 main types of trace fossils. There's resting traces produced by organisms at rest, locomotion traces produced by organisms moving along the sediment surface, grazing traces produced by organisms that burrow through sediment and extract nutrients or food from the sediment particles, and then feeding traces, traces produced by feeding of organisms, and finally dwelling traces, traces that are burrows that are actually the home of the organism. The burrows in the background are probably grazing traces. They look like they were made by organisms sort of grazing about the same layer of sediment. They cross-cut each other and they branch out in different ways. Trace fossils are important because organisms tend to have different dwelling, feeding, etc. strategies in different environments. So trace fossils are often a good indicator of environment. And a good example of that is this trace fossil. Called Scolitos, which is a vertical burrow found in sand and sandstone and is a good indicator for a beach environment. These are always found in sandstone. They reflect a drill deep, straight down type of behavior that's common to organisms that live in high energy beach environments. Well, we won't have time in this class to talk about this in any great detail, but this illustration is a summary of the type of environments that different types of burrows occur in, from the beach to the open ocean. This would be the continental shelf, slope, and then the abyssal plain. These would be different types of coastlines based on whether they're rocky, semi-consolidated, or sandy. And these vertical arrows link down to pictures of the types of burrows that you might find in these different environments. In general, the types of burrows that occur in any given environment depend on the energy in the environment, the type of substrate found in the environment, and also the depth beneath the sediment surface. So right at the surface, you may find a different type of burrow than if you were to dig down deeper.